Hey guys, welcome to your second set of Ecology video notes. This set of video notes is going to focus primarily on the cycles of matter and then a little bit about human impact at the end. So before we get into the cycles, let's talk about just matter in general. So hopefully you know, or if not you do now, that we have a fixed amount of matter that is in the biosphere. That means nothing new is formed. Forms change and things change within each ecosystem, but there's never something new that's brought in. So energy itself has to be transformed into those usable forms to support ecosystem function. And we'll talk about how that is in each of the different cycles. And you also need to understand that it involves both matter in living organisms and physical processes. So let's talk about the four major cycles. So carbon, oxygen, water, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Let's start with the carbon-oxygen cycle. So I would take a second here and pause the video and just kind of examine this image. All right, so now that you've looked at it, you should see that there's lots of different parts to this. It is a cycle, but there's different cycles within that. So first of all, you see photosynthesis. Whoops, we're gonna go back. You see photosynthesis and your plants. Oh my gosh, hang on. All right, you see the photosynthesis in plants here. Your primary consumers are going to eat the plants. Then your secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. And then these organisms do cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration and photosynthesis, hopefully you remember, the products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cell respiration and then vice versa in the cycle. You also have organisms like plants and animals that die over time, and that's where decomposition comes in. And eventually, over lots and lots and lots of time, they get compressed and will form fossil fuels, which are burned or used and put CO2 into the atmosphere. Obviously, there's some problems here. We release way more CO2 into the atmosphere than we should, and that causes lots of other human impact issues we'll get to towards the end of this video. So here's a quick review. Plants consume water and CO2. They produce glucose and oxygen. Animals do the opposite. So they consume glucose and oxygen, they produce water and CO2. Carbon and oxygen then are constantly cycling through photosynthesis and cell respiration. So those plants take up that CO2, and then they have two purposes in this cycle. The first is they produce oxygen, which goes to the consumers, and the second is they also serve as a food source. So this is the primary cycle that's within this, but like we talked about in the previous slide, we also have that combustion and the fossil fuels releasing excess CO2. So those decomposers are going to be important for that fossil fuel formation, and this is how these are formed. So things like gasoline, oil, coal, those are all fossil fuels, and things like cars, for example, are going to use, which releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Now let's get to the water cycle. This is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's pretty simple. You spend a decent amount of time learning about this in elementary school, but we have the usuals, so condensation, precipitation, evaporation, accumulation might be a little new to you. That's just when water accumulates in a body of water like a lake or a pond or something like that. Some of the new subjects might be transpiration, which is when plants release water, and then things like runoff. Runoff is simply just precipitation that moves down a land form. So you should also know there's a limited amount of water on Earth. So we're always recycling water. So that's why it's super important that water stays clean. Water pollution is a big problem because the water cycle is just reusing that water over and over. So the nitrogen cycle is going to be a little more complex to understand than the first two cycles we've gone over. So once again, I would pause this video and just examine this diagram for a minute. All right, so in this diagram, you'll see lots of things. So primarily is all the different nitrogen compounds. So there's nitrogen in the atmosphere, there's nitrates, there's ammonium, and then there's these things called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So in this cycle, 79% of the air is actually nitrogen, but the cycle itself, we don't really breathe nitrogen. We can't. So it has to get to our bodies from other ways. So we rely on something called nitrogen fixation. So this is simply just the process to make nitrogen usable for our bodies. There's 3 ways it can be made. Lightning, there's nitrogen fixing bacteria on the roots of plants, and then human factories can also do it. So the bacteria itself is something that is so important to our ability to get nitrogen, and it changes nitrogen into usable forms for us. So there's 3 major plants that you'll hear referenced that contain this bacteria in their roots. Things like legumes over here, which are beans, clover, or alfalfa. So clover, for example, if you see clover in your yard, that means you have a lot of nitrogen in your lawn because the clover is producing all that nitrogen from the unusable forms for organisms. So how does this cycle even work? So nitrogen fixation has to occur, which is what makes nitrogen usable for organisms. Plants then use that nitrogen, then heterotrophs eat the plant or an animal that ate the plant. So there you either have your primary consumers, which are eating the plant, and then your secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Like us, for example, we could get nitrogen either by eating plant material or eating animal. Then at the end, decomposers are going to break down the dead organisms and release that nitrogen gas, which is the original form of nitrogen. And this process is called denitrification. The phosphorus cycle is the final cycle we're going to talk about, and this one's a little bit different because it does not take place in the atmosphere like the other 3. This cycle primarily takes place in rocks. So once again, pause your video here and take a moment to look at this diagram. All right, so as you look at it, you'll probably see a couple things that stand out. We have the words organic compounds and inorganic compounds, and then there's lots of rock that shows up here. So with the phosphorus cycle, it takes place mostly in rocks, like I said. So things like rain or other precipitation are going to fall on rocks and produce this runoff. Well, that runoff has phosphorus in it, also known as phosphates or inorganic phosphates. This travels into the soil or the water, and where it is transformed into organic phosphates by plants. So plants take up the phosphates, and then once again, the importance of plants, right? Animals are going to eat the plants, or they eat an animal that ate the plant, and that's how they get their phosphorus. So that's how we get our phosphorus. Then when animals die, detritivores or decomposers are going to turn organic phosphates back into inorganic phosphates, which is how this whole cycle starts all over again with that runoff. Now let's talk a little bit more about human impact. So first of all, our human population is huge. It keeps growing. We have exponential growth. We have yet to reach a carrying capacity. And there's lots of different theories out there about when that will happen, if it will happen, what the number is, all of those things. But let's talk about why the human population has grown so fast in the first place. So there's 3 major things we're going to focus on right now. So the first being agriculture. So over time, humans have domesticated animals. We have a constant food source. We don't have to go hunt for our food in the woods anymore or gather our fruits or seeds or nuts or anything like that. And then with that is machines. So we have machines that do things for us. There's not people that are out picking cotton or out picking crops from the fields. Machines do that, making it much more beneficial for us. There's also medical advancements. So if you look back to early outbreaks of disease and things like that, a lot of it related to the fact that there was no type of a sewer system. So human waste was flowing in with drinking water and you were bathing in it and it was in your food and all sorts of people got sick. We also have medicine. So antibiotics are helping with bacterial infections and helping people live longer with other major diseases as well. And then you also have the Industrial Revolution. So this in general led to a better economy. People had more income. They could support a higher family numbers. So all of these things have contributed to this growth. But of course, as always, we have some problems. So invasive species are a huge thing, and a lot of that is due to humans bringing things over. I have kudzu there, which I'm sure you're all familiar with how invasive that is. Even things like iguanas, if you've ever seen them in Florida, they're considered an invasive species because people let them go because they got too big. We also have poaching and species extinction in general. pollution like you see over here with all of this trash on the ocean beach, global warming and the greenhouse effect, which we'll get to in a second, deforestation, biomagnification, which is how different substances move up the food chain in higher amounts, and eutrophication, which results in things like these really nasty algae blooms. So the greenhouse effect itself is the constant release of excess CO2 that results in the atmosphere trapping the gases. And unfortunately, it kind of is like a greenhouse. It keeps the planet extra warm, which is what we don't want to happen. The problem as a result is the ocean's going to help absorb that extra heat, causing the ocean temperature to increase. This is how ice caps are melting, water levels are rising, and globally, the ocean has been shown to now rise over an inch a decade, which is huge. We also have ocean acidification, which has been a really popular topic lately. So the ocean functions as a carbon sink, meaning it absorbs excess CO2, all those fossil fuel emissions we talked about earlier. Well, carbonic acid is released as a result of that combination of CO2 with the ocean water. And the problem with this is there's lots of ocean organisms that need this to build their exoskeletons. And also the ocean pH is more acidic, resulting in coral bleaching. This here is showing you just how shells have deteriorated over time from lack of that free carbonate. Eutrophication is another huge problem that we've been seeing. There was an outbreak in Florida not too long ago. There's been several outbreaks kind of all over. But land runoff, so that excess nitrogen and phosphorus, which is in fertilizer, it enters bodies of water. And as a result, plant life explodes, specifically algae, and it chokes off all the fish and animals that live below the algae. So as a result, you get these mass deaths of fish and plants, and it smells, and it's toxic, and it's gross, and no one wants to go to these places. So eutrophication is a huge, huge problem. In addition to that is toxins in the food chain, resulting in two major terms. The first being bioaccumulation, which is just an increase in a pollutant over time in an organism, such as this poor little fish here. The contaminant, as the fish lives out his life, he ingests more and more contamination, resulting in more accumulation in his body. The other being biomagnification. So this is the increase of a pollutant through a food chain. And this diagram over here is showing PCBs, but mercury is also really popular to talk about in terms of biomagnification, because you have these little tiny organisms that it's not that big of a deal for them. But as you see, the red dots represent the concentration. And as you move up to the large mammals, look at how high that concentration is. And guess what? We also eat at the top of the food chain. So we have a very high accumulation in our bodies as well. And lastly, I want to talk just briefly about plastic. So plastic pollution has been a huge, huge thing in the media lately. And I want you to know a little history, but also a little bit about why it's so terrible. So after World War II, there was better technology, and as a result, plastic use became more widespread, such as this Time article in Life magazine in 1955 that said, ooh, throwaway living. You can have whatever you want. No one needs to worry about dishes because everything's plastic. Let's just throw it away. Unfortunately, that caught on very quickly, and now plastic is found everywhere, even uninhabited islands, which is a huge problem. So what forms is called nurdles, or mermaid tears, and these are these pre-production pellets. Well, a lot of animals mistake it for food. It looks very similar to fish eggs, for example, and this can be found on almost every beach in the world. The other issue, which we briefly talked about a second ago, is the food chain, and guess who's at the top? We are. So we're eating plastic in addition to these major chemicals and toxins that kind of hitchhike on the plastic as it moves up the food chain. And while in the US, not necessarily, we don't rely on fish as our main protein source, in many other countries, fish is their main source of protein. So this is a huge problem. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about plastic in class as well as human impact, but that is it for your notes.